It was a cold February evening in 1968 when a young man stepped into a payphone booth on the corner of 165th Street in Harlem, New York. The streetlights flickered above him, the wind cut through his thin coat. He pulled a few coins from his pocket, dropped them into the slot, and began to dial a number he had dialed 1,000 times before. His name was Franklin Joseph Lymon, but the world had once known him simply as Frankie, the boy with the voice that had made millions of people fall in love with music, the 13-year-old who had stood on stages in London, Paris, and New York, the face on magazine covers, the smile in newsreels, the sound that had defined an entire generation of teenage hearts. But on this night, he was 25 years old and he was alone. The phone rang twice on the other end. Then a familiar voice answered. Hello, it was his mother. Frankie closed his eyes for a moment. Mama, he said quietly, it is me. Nobody listening to that call could have known it would be the last time Frankie Lymon would ever speak to his mother. Nobody could have known that the next 7 minutes would become a memory she would carry, silently, for the rest of her life. A memory she would refuse to share with reporters, biographers, or even close family members. A memory she would take to her grave decades later. But the people who knew Frankie best, the friends who saw him in his final weeks, the producers who were trying to help him rebuild his career, the neighbors who watched him return to Harlem after years of being lost in the world, they all agreed on one thing. In those final months of his life, Frankie was different. He was quieter. He was kinder. He was searching for something. And on that February night, in that cold phone booth, he believed he had finally found it. To understand what happened in that 7-minute phone call, you have to understand how Frankie Lymon got there. You have to understand the boy before the legend, and the man behind the smile. Frankie was born on September 30th, 1942 in Washington Heights, New York. His father, Howard Lymon, was a truck driver and an amateur singer who performed gospel music in the local churches. His mother, Jeanette Lymon, was a domestic worker who sang lullabies to her children in the evenings, her voice soft and warm in the cramped apartment they all shared. Frankie was the third of 5 children. From the moment he could speak, he could sing. By the time he was 8 years old, neighbors would stop on the sidewalk just to hear him hum melodies through the open window. By the time he was 10, he was performing in talent shows at school, his small voice somehow filling entire auditoriums. There was something about Frankie's voice, something pure, something that did not seem to belong to a child. People who heard him for the first time often described the same feeling. They felt as if they were hearing music for the first time in their lives. When Frankie was 12 years old, he met 4 older boys from the neighborhood who were trying to start a singing group. Sherman Garnes, Jimmy Merchant, Joe Negroni, and Herman Santiago. They called themselves the Premiers. They needed a high voice to balance their harmonies, and someone had told them about the kid down the street with the angel voice. Frankie auditioned for them on a stoop in Harlem, singing softly so the neighbors would not complain. The older boys looked at each other in disbelief. Within minutes, Frankie was a member of the group. Within months, the group had a new name, the Teenagers, and within a year they would record a song that would change music forever. The song was called Why Do Fools Fall in Love. Frankie was 13 years old when he stepped up to the microphone at Rama Records in 1955. He was nervous, his voice cracked on the first take. The producer almost sent him home, but on the second take, Frankie closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and let go. What came out of his mouth that day became one of the most beloved recordings in the history of popular music. Within weeks of its release in early 1956, the song was climbing every chart in America. Within months, it had crossed the Atlantic Ocean and was playing on radios in London, Paris, and Berlin. Within a year, Frankie Lymon was the most famous teenage singer in the world. He was 13 years old when he met the Queen of England. He was 13 years old when he sang for sold-out crowds at the London Palladium. He was 13 years old when he was given his own television specials, his own movie roles, his own dressing rooms with his name on the door. Newspapers called him a miracle. Magazines called him the voice of a generation. Older artists, men twice his age, lined up to shake his hand and tell him he was the future of music. And through it all, Frankie smiled. He laughed. He performed. He gave interviews where he talked about how grateful he was, how lucky he felt, how much he loved his mother. But there was something nobody saw, something Frankie himself did not have the words to describe. He was lonely, not the ordinary loneliness of a child who misses his parents. A different kind of loneliness. The loneliness of a 13-year-old boy who is suddenly responsible for the financial future of his entire family. The loneliness of a child who is sent on tour for months at a time, surrounded by adults who see him as a product, not a person. The loneliness of a young performer who wakes up in hotel rooms in cities he has never heard of, with no idea what time zone he is in, no idea when he will see his mother again, no idea if anyone in the world cares about the boy beneath the voice. Frankie did not complain. He had been raised to be polite. He had been raised to work hard. He had been raised to be grateful for every opportunity. So he kept smiling. He kept singing. He kept signing autographs for fans who screamed his name and reached for his clothes and treated him like he belonged to them. And inside, slowly, something began to break. By the time Frankie was 15 years old, the cracks were beginning to show. His managers had pushed him into a solo career, separating him from the boys who had been his closest friends. The teenagers were left behind. Frankie was now expected to perform alone, to carry an entire show on his shoulders, to be a man before he had ever been allowed to be a teenager. His voice, that miraculous voice that had made him famous, was beginning to change. Puberty was arriving, and with it came a new and terrifying problem. The high notes that had been his signature were becoming harder to reach. Producers panicked. Record labels grew nervous. The boy who had been a sure thing was suddenly a risk. Frankie watched his career begin to slip through his fingers. He watched the people who had once promised him the world begin to look elsewhere. And in those years, in his middle teens, he was introduced to something that he believed would help him cope with the pressure, something that would dull the loneliness, something that would eventually take more from him than he had ever imagined possible. We will not dwell on those years here. Frankie's struggles are well documented, and they have been told and retold in ways that often forget the human being at the center of them. What matters, for the purpose of this story, is what came next. What matters is that Frankie Lymon, despite everything, never stopped trying to come back. He never stopped believing that his voice still had something to offer. He never stopped writing letters to his mother, telling her that he was going to be okay. He never stopped dreaming. By the autumn of 1967, Frankie was 25 years old, and he was trying to rebuild his life. He had recently joined the United States Army, hoping that the structure and discipline would help him start over. He had been granted leave to return to New York to record new music with Roulette Records, the label that had once made him famous. He had a producer who believed in him. He had songs he had been writing in private. He had a small apartment in Harlem, just a few blocks from where he had grown up, and he had something he had not had in many years: hope. The friends who saw Frankie in those final months all described the same young man. He was thinner than he had been in his prime, but his eyes were clearer. He laughed easily. He talked about the future. He talked about songs he wanted to record. He talked about going back on tour, this time on his own terms. He talked about his mother. He talked about his mother almost constantly. One friend, a fellow musician named Eddie, would later say that Frankie had spoken about his mother more in those final weeks than in all the years he had known him. It was as if Frankie was remembering something he had forgotten, as if he was finding his way back to something he had lost a long time ago. On the morning of February 27, 1968, Frankie spent several hours at the studio working on new material. His producer would later recall that Frankie was in good spirits that day. He was joking with the engineers. He was experimenting with new vocal styles. His voice, which had matured into a richer and warmer tone, sounded better than it had in years. At one point, Frankie pulled the producer aside and asked him a question that nobody understood at the time. He asked, "Do you think my mother would be proud of me right now?" The producer laughed and said, "Of course she would be." Frankie nodded slowly and went back to the microphone. That evening, after the session ended, Frankie left the studio and walked through Harlem. The streets were quiet. The air was cold. He passed the corners where he had played as a child. He passed the church where his father had once sung in the choir. He passed the school where he had performed in his first talent show, the one where the music teacher had looked at his mother and said, "Your son is something special." He kept walking, and eventually he came to a payphone on the corner of 165th Street. He stood outside the booth for a long time before going in. People who saw him that night, neighbors who recognized him, would later say that he looked like a man who was thinking very hard about something, like a man who was preparing himself. He finally stepped inside the booth, dropped his coins into the slot, and dialed his mother's number. "Hello, Mama," he said. "It is me. Nobody knows exactly what was said in the 7 minutes that followed. Jeanette Lymon, Frankie's mother, refused to share the contents of that phone call with anyone ever. Reporters asked her, biographers asked her, even members of her own family asked her. In the years that came after, she would only say one thing. She would only say that her son had called to tell her that he loved her. She would only say that he had thanked her for everything she had done for him. She would only say that he had asked for her forgiveness, though she did not understand at the time what he wanted to be forgiven for. But there were small details that emerged over time, pieces of the conversation that Jeanette shared in fragments with a few people she trusted, pieces that, when put together, paint a picture of a young man who was trying, in his own way, to come home. He told her about the studio session that day. He told her how good his voice had sounded. He told her that the producer was pleased, that there were going to be new records, that he believed he could do this. He told her about his apartment in Harlem, how it was small but clean, how he had been cooking for himself, how he had been writing songs at the kitchen table late at night. He told her that he was sorry he had not been a better son. He told her that he was sorry for the years he had been lost. He told her that he was going to make it up to her. He told her that when his next album came out, he was going to put her name on it. He told her that he was going to take her to dinner. He told her that he was going to buy her a house, a real house, not an apartment with a garden in the back where she could plant flowers like she had always wanted. He told her these things the way a child tells his mother things, with hope, with certainty, with the absolute belief that the future would arrive exactly as he was describing it. And then, near the end of the call, he said something that his mother would remember for the rest of her life, something she would think about every single day until her own death many years later, something she would whisper to herself in the quiet hours of the morning when she could not sleep, when the memory of her son was the only thing keeping her company. He said, "Mama, I want you to know that whatever happens, I was always your boy, the boy who used to sing in the kitchen. That was the real me. Everything else was just noise." Jeanette Lymon did not understand at that moment what her son was telling her. She thought he was being sentimental. She thought he was tired. She thought he was looking back the way young people sometimes do when they have been through difficult years and are starting to feel hopeful again. She told him that of course he was her boy, that he would always be her boy, that she loved him more than anything in the world. She told him to come over for dinner that weekend. She told him she would make his favorite meal. She told him she was proud of him. She told him she had always been proud of him. He was quiet for a long moment. And then he said, "I love you, Mama. I will see you soon." He hung up the phone. He never came to dinner. The next morning, on February 28, 1968, Frankie Lymon was found in his grandmother's apartment in Harlem. He had passed away during the night. He was 25 years old. The news traveled quickly through the music world, but slowly through the streets of Harlem. Many of the people who had known Frankie as a child did not learn of his death until days later. His mother received the news in the early hours of the morning. She was alone in her apartment when the phone rang. She would later say that she knew what the call was about before she answered it. She would say that something had been different about the conversation the night before, something she had not been able to name. She would say that she had stood by the phone for several minutes before picking it up, because some part of her did not want to know. When she did pick it up, and when she did hear the words, she did not scream, she did not cry, not at first. She simply set the phone down very carefully on the table, walked into her son's old bedroom, the bedroom he had slept in as a child, and sat on the edge of the bed. She looked at the walls. She looked at the small dresser where he had once kept his school books. She looked at the window where, as a boy, he had stood and sang to the street below, his voice drifting out into the morning air. And then she closed her eyes and she remembered the boy, not the singer, not the star, not the headline, her boy, the one who had called her the night before to tell her that he had always been her boy. The funeral was held a few days later. It was attended by family, by close friends, by a few musicians who had known Frankie in his early days. It was not a large funeral. The music industry, which had once celebrated him as the future of popular music, did not send many representatives. The stadiums that had once been filled with screaming fans were silent. The newspapers that had once put his face on their covers gave him a small obituary on a back page. In the years that followed, Frankie's story would be told many times, often in ways that focused on the difficult parts of his life and overlooked the human being at the center of it all. The boy who had loved his mother, the young man who had been trying to come back, the artist who had given the world a voice that nobody had heard before and nobody has heard since. Jeanette Lymon lived for many years after her son's death. She rarely gave interviews. She rarely spoke publicly about Frankie. When she did speak, she always returned to the same memory, the memory of that final phone call, the memory of his voice on the line, the memory of him telling her that he had always been her boy. Years later, a journalist would ask her if there was anything she wished she had said differently in that conversation, anything she wished she had told him. She thought about the question for a long time before answering, and then she said no. There was nothing more to say. He told me he loved me. I told him I loved him. That was the whole of it. That is the whole of any life that matters. She paused, and then she added one more thing. She said, I think he knew. I think somehow he knew that night. And I think he wanted me to know that he was at peace, that whatever had happened in his life, whatever the world had done to him, in that final moment, he was just my boy again. The boy who used to sing in the kitchen, the boy with the voice, the boy I loved. The phone booth on the corner of 165th Street is no longer there. The streets of Harlem have changed many times since 1968. The studios where Frankie recorded his final sessions have been replaced by other buildings. The stages where he once performed have been demolished or renovated beyond recognition. The world that knew Frankie Lymon at the height of his fame has, in many ways, disappeared. But the music remains. Why Do Fools Fall in Love still plays on radios around the world. It has been covered by hundreds of artists in dozens of languages. It has been used in films, in television shows, in commercials. It has been sung at weddings and at funerals. It has introduced generation after generation to the voice of a 13-year-old boy from Harlem who, for one brief and shining moment, made the entire world stop and listen. And every time the song plays somewhere, someone who knows the story remembers. They remember the boy in the kitchen. They remember the mother who lost her son. They remember the 7-minute phone call on a cold February evening when a young man stood in a payphone booth on a Harlem street corner and told his mother, in his own way, that he was going home. Frankie Lymon was 25 years old when he died. He had given the world 10 years of music. He had given his mother 25 years of love. And in his final phone call, he gave her the only thing he had left to give. The truth. The truth that beneath all the fame, beneath all the noise, beneath all the years of being lost, he had always been her boy. The boy who used to sing in the kitchen. The boy who had never really left. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of someone you love, if it made you want to pick up the phone and call someone who matters to you, then please take a moment to do that now. Some calls cannot wait. Some words cannot be saved for later. Some people need to hear tonight that they are loved. Subscribe for more stories about the legends who shaped music history, the artists we lost too soon, the voices that still echo through time, and the human beings behind the headlines. Because every legend was once just somebody's child, just somebody's boy, just somebody's reason to believe that the world could be a more beautiful place. Thank you for listening.